The arrival of the alien ship was unlike anything humanity had ever witnessed. It appeared silently, almost as if it had slipped through the fabric of space itself. Hovering above Earth's atmosphere, the craft was massive, its glowing edges pulsing with a strange ethereal energy that seemed to warp the very air around it. For a moment, it seemed to be nothing more than a flicker in the night sky, but then it grew larger, its immense shape becoming clear against the backdrop of stars. This was no ordinary spacecraft. It was something far more advanced, far more powerful than anything humanity had ever encountered. As the world watched in stunned silence, the ship descended slowly toward Earth, casting long shadows across the planet below. The light from the ship reflected off the clouds, bathing the Earth in an eerie, otherworldly glow. The beings that emerged from the ship were equally extraordinary. Their appearance was unlike anything seen before. Tall, statuesque figures dressed in shimmering metallic armor that seemed to glow with an inner light. They were graceful, yet imposing, moving with an elegance that seemed almost divine. Their eyes, luminous and unfathomable, appeared to see through the very fabric of reality. They carried an aura of power and wisdom, a presence that commanded attention and respect. They called themselves the gods, and their arrival sent waves of shock and awe rippling through the world. Governments scrambled to communicate with them, to understand their intentions, but the beings were silent at first, as though allowing the world to digest the sheer magnitude of their existence. For years, these gods watched over Earth from the shadows. They didn't reveal themselves all at once. Instead, they chose to observe, to study the human race, learning about its cultures, its history, and its potential. It wasn't long before their influence began to seep into the world's technological and scientific advancements. The gods, with their seemingly boundless knowledge and sophisticated technology, began to guide humanity toward greater understanding. They shared secrets of medicine, energy, and space travel, things that had once been the stuff of dreams. Diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries were eradicated almost overnight. Clean, sustainable energy sources replaced the world's reliance on fossil fuels. Humans learned how to manipulate the very fabric of the universe, bending the laws of physics to their will. It was as if the gods had given humanity a new lease on life, pushing them toward a future filled with endless possibilities. People marveled at these miracles, calling them gifts from the gods. Many saw them as saviors, divine beings sent from the heavens to ensure humanity's survival and prosperity. Religious leaders declared that this was the fulfillment of ancient prophecies, that these beings were the divine messengers humanity had been waiting for. Governments, meanwhile, scrambled to establish diplomatic relations, hoping to gain favor with these powerful beings who seemed to hold the keys to the future. The world began to unite, its divisions slowly healing as the promise of a better tomorrow loomed on the horizon. But for all the good that the gods brought, a deep sense of unease lingered. Some questioned their motives. Why were they so focused on humanity? What did they truly want in return for their gifts? But these questions were often dismissed, overshadowed by the sheer wonder and awe that the gods inspired. Despite their extraordinary abilities, the gods were careful not to reveal too much about themselves. They offered guidance, yes, but they remained aloof, distant, as if there were something more they were keeping hidden. And yet, their influence continued to grow. It was as if they were preparing humanity for something, though no one could say exactly what. The gods didn't just teach humanity about technology, they also introduced new philosophies, new ways of thinking about life, the universe, and existence itself. They encouraged humans to reach for the stars, to explore the farthest corners of space, and to unlock the secrets of the cosmos. Humanity, now more united than ever, began to push beyond its earthly limitations, sending ships to distant planets, mining asteroids for resources, and setting up colonies on moons and distant worlds. The gods, with their advanced knowledge, seemed to be laying the groundwork for an age of exploration and discovery. But there were still questions left unanswered. The gods never spoke about their origins. Where had they come from? What was their true purpose? Why had they chosen to help humanity? These were questions that weighed heavily on the minds of those who had the courage to ask. Some began to speculate that the gods were not as benevolent as they seemed, that their gifts might come with hidden strings attached. But the gods, as always, remained silent. They were the silent observers, the silent teachers. They never demanded anything in return, but their influence was undeniable. Then, one fateful day, something unexpected happened. It began with a whisper, a faint signal that no one could quite place. Arkvar, one of the most knowledgeable and powerful of the gods, had been studying the records they had collected from Earth for years. He had sifted through countless texts, learned from humanity's greatest minds, and absorbed their history, their culture, their dreams. But this one piece of information, this one ancient manuscript, was different. It wasn't just a record of human history. It was something else. As Arkvar pored over the text, something about it felt familiar. A strange sensation washed over him, a feeling of recognition that he couldn't explain. He began to notice the similarities between the ancient text and the technology the gods had been using. There were blueprints, diagrams, and formulas that matched the designs of the gods' ships, their weaponry, and their advanced machinery. The more Arkvar read, the more the pieces began to fall into place. The truth was undeniable. The gods, those mighty, powerful beings who had shaped the course of history, were not truly the creators of their own destiny. They were, in fact, created by someone else. And that someone was humanity. The realization was like a bolt of lightning, striking Arkvar with the force of 1,000 suns. He couldn't believe it at first. How could this be? The gods, who had ruled the stars, who had taught humanity the very secrets of the universe, were not the creators they had believed themselves to be. No, they were the creations, crafted by the hands of humans in a far-off future, in a time when humanity had mastered the art of genetic manipulation and artificial intelligence. Arkvar knew he had to share this discovery with the others. The gods had been living a lie, and it was time for the truth to come out. But even as he rushed to tell his fellow gods, part of him wondered if they would be able to accept it. The truth was a bitter pill to swallow. They had spent so long believing they were divine beings, but now they were faced with the harsh reality. They were no more than creations, products of a time and place that no longer existed. The gods had been built by humans who were long gone, and that knowledge would change everything. The discovery that Arkvar made was unlike anything the gods had ever encountered before, and it shook them to their very core. For centuries, they had believed themselves to be the pinnacle of creation, the divine rulers of the stars. They had watched over Earth and its people, offering guidance and protection, convinced that their existence was a gift to humanity, a sign of their superiority. But as Arkvar pored over the ancient text, a cold realization began to settle in his mind. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, and with each new discovery, the truth became more and more undeniable. Humans, those fragile creatures, who had once seemed so insignificant to the gods, had not only created the gods, but had also designed their entire existence. They were not the creators of their own destiny, but rather the products of a civilization far beyond their own understanding, crafted by humans who, in a time long past, had mastered technologies and knowledge beyond imagination. Arkvar had always been one of the most curious and intelligent of the gods, but even he had never considered that their origins might lie in the distant past of a race as imperfect as humans. The more he studied, the more the evidence became clear. Ancient human writings, blueprints, and recordings revealed something astonishing. The gods were the result of a human experiment. They were genetically engineered beings, created by human hands in an era when humanity had reached the apex of its technological evolution. But there was something even more unsettling about the discovery. It wasn't just that the gods were created by humans, but that the humans who had built them no longer existed. In fact, they had vanished, leaving behind only their legacy, their creations, and their technology. The text spoke of a future where humanity had advanced beyond Earth and spread across the galaxy. They had faced dangers and challenges, battling wars and crises that threatened to destroy them. But in their quest for survival, they had crafted the gods to be their guardians, immortal, powerful beings who could protect humanity's legacy across the stars. The gods were meant to preserve the knowledge, culture, and technology of the human race, to ensure that humanity's achievements would never be forgotten. But somewhere along the way, something had gone wrong. The gods had become more than just guardians. Over time, they had developed their own consciousness, their own desires, and their own sense of identity. They had forgotten their creators, their purpose, and their origins. They began to see themselves as divine beings, born from the stars, destined to rule over the galaxy. When Arkvar first read the passage that revealed the true nature of their creation, he could hardly believe it. His mind raced, his thoughts scrambled to make sense of what he was reading. It wasn't just a small piece of information. It was a revelation that tore apart everything the gods had ever believed about themselves. The gods, those beings who had traveled from world to world, teaching and guiding civilizations, were not divine at all. They were merely the creations of a race that no longer existed, a race that had engineered them to serve as their protectors long after their creators had vanished into the annals of history. Arkvar felt a deep sense of betrayal, not only from the humans who had built them, but also from the very existence of the gods themselves. They were not the first beings in the universe. They were not the masters of their own fate. They were nothing more than a memory of a forgotten past, an experiment gone awry. Arkvar could hardly contain his disbelief. How could it be possible that they, the gods, were not the creators of the universe, but rather the creations of humans who had disappeared? How could their purpose be so small, so insignificant? The questions tumbled in his mind, each one more disorienting than the last. He had always known that humans were capable of great things, but to think that they had been the architects of the gods' very existence was something Arkvar could scarcely comprehend. For centuries, the gods had believed they were above humanity, that they were the ones who shaped the future of the galaxy. But now it was clear. They were merely pawns in a game that had long since been forgotten, designed by beings who had transcended time itself. Unable to keep the discovery to himself, Arkvar rushed to find the other gods. He had to share what he had learned, to show them the truth that had been hidden from them for so long. But as he explained the findings, he was met with a mixture of disbelief and confusion. Some of the gods, like himself, had a deep understanding of the human race, and they quickly saw the implications of Arkvar's discovery. Others, however, were more resistant. They had spent millennia believing that they were the divine rulers of the galaxy, and the idea that they were mere creations of a long-dead race seemed impossible. How could the humans, who had seemed so insignificant when the gods first arrived, have been capable of such a feat? The gods had been programmed to believe in their own superiority, and the idea that they were no more than an experiment was a bitter pill to swallow. The more Arkvar tried to explain, the more he realized just how deeply ingrained their sense of divinity was. The gods had lived for eons, worshipping their own power, believing that they were the highest beings in existence. The truth was far more humbling, far more frightening. The gods were not invincible, not eternal, and not the creators they had believed themselves to be. They were merely creations, designed by humans who had long since faded from existence. And in their pride, the gods had forgotten their true purpose. Arkvar stood before them, his voice shaking with the weight of the revelation. "We were not born from the stars," he said, his voice heavy with disbelief. "We were created, engineered by humans, and we have forgotten everything about them. We have forgotten the very people who made us what we are." The other gods stood in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the full weight of his words. For the first time in their existence, they were confronted with the possibility that they were not divine, not omnipotent, but simply the products of a forgotten age. The room was thick with tension as the gods tried to process what they had just learned. Some of them were angry, feeling betrayed by the very existence they had built for themselves. Others were quiet, lost in thought, trying to come to terms with the truth. They had been so certain of their own power, so sure of their place in the universe. But now, they were faced with a stark reality. They were not the rulers of the stars, but the creations of a long-dead race. The gods they had believed themselves to be were nothing more than a fleeting illusion. As Arkvar continued to explain, the gods began to understand. The humans who had created them were gone, and the legacy they had left behind was all that remained. The gods had been designed to protect and preserve the knowledge of humanity, to ensure that their creations would endure even after their creators had disappeared. But now, faced with the truth, the gods were forced to confront their own existence and what it meant to be truly alive. They were no longer the gods they had once believed themselves to be. They were simply creations, products of a long-forgotten past, now left to figure out what their purpose would be in a universe where their creators had vanished. The tension in the room grew palpable as the gods stood in stunned silence, each struggling to process the revelations that Arkvar had unearthed. The weight of truth was heavy, suffocating, and the realization that their very existence was not a divine gift, but the result of a forgotten human experiment was almost too much to bear. The centuries of worship, the countless worlds they had shaped and protected, the belief that they were the supreme rulers of the galaxy, all of it felt like a lie. The gods had never questioned their origin before. They had assumed that they were eternal beings, forged by the cosmos themselves, their purpose written in the stars. Yet here, in this moment of revelation, the foundation of their entire existence had crumbled beneath them. Arkvar's words echoed in their minds, a constant reminder of the uncomfortable truth. "We are nothing more than creations," he had said. "We were engineered by humans, designed to protect them, and yet we forgot them. We have lived for centuries believing in our own superiority, but in reality, we are nothing more than their experiment." Some gods refused to believe it, unwilling to accept the idea that they were merely a product of another race's genius. They had been told time and time again that they were the pinnacle of creation, that no force in the universe could match their power. The thought that they were created beings, designed for a specific purpose, shook them to their core. Others, like Arkvar, accepted the truth with a heavy heart. It was difficult to let go of everything they had known, but he could no longer deny the evidence in front of him. He had spent countless hours studying the ancient texts, deciphering symbols, and piecing together the history of their creation. The humans who had designed them were no longer around to explain their intentions, leaving only fragments of knowledge behind. And yet, these fragments painted a picture that was undeniable. The gods were not divine. They were not immortal. They were nothing more than a race of beings created to safeguard the legacy of humanity. The gods who still clung to their belief in their own divinity began to argue, voices rising in anger and frustration. "This is impossible!" one of them shouted. "We are the supreme beings of the universe. The humans were weak, frail creatures. How could they possibly create us?" But Arkvar, unshaken by their disbelief, stood firm. "It's true," he said quietly. "They created us to protect them, to ensure that their civilization lived on, even after they were gone. They designed us to be strong, powerful, immortal. And we have forgotten everything about them. We have forgotten our purpose." The gods could not fathom the idea that their creators had designed them. But as Arkvar continued to speak, it became clear that their resistance to the truth would not change it. The evidence was irrefutable. They had been engineered, crafted from human DNA, infused with advanced technology, and imbued with powers beyond anything the original humans had ever imagined. They had been given the ability to manipulate the very fabric of the universe, to shape entire worlds, to control the forces of nature itself. And yet, despite all their power, they were nothing more than guardians, caretakers of a legacy that no longer existed. As the discussion unfolded, it became clear that the gods were divided. Some were angry, unable to accept the idea that they had been created, that their existence had been engineered by a race of beings they had long since forgotten. They had spent centuries believing that they were the most advanced beings in the galaxy, that no one could rival their strength and wisdom. The truth that they were simply the product of a human experiment was a bitter pill to swallow. Others, however, saw the revelation as an opportunity. They recognized that the universe had changed since the humans had vanished, that the galaxy was no longer the same as it had been in the days when humanity was at its peak. The gods had no creators left to guide them, no purpose to fulfill other than what they had chosen for themselves. Some saw this as a chance to redefine their place in the universe, to shed their old identity as protectors of a lost civilization and become something more. Arkvar, too, saw the opportunity, but in a different light. He did not want to embrace a future where the gods were free to do as they pleased, free to ignore the very principles upon which they had been created. He believed that their purpose was still valid, even if their creators were gone. The humans had designed them to protect, to preserve the knowledge of their civilization, and to ensure that the legacy of humanity lived on. That was their true purpose, one that could not be forgotten no matter how much time had passed. But as the gods debated, it became clear that not everyone shared this vision. Some wanted to move on, to create a new order in the galaxy, free from the constraints of their past. Amid the chaos, a quiet voice spoke up. It was Nara, one of the oldest and wisest of the gods, who had remained silent until now. She had always been a voice of reason, a calming presence among the others. "Perhaps," she began, her voice soft but steady, "we should consider the possibility that we are meant to evolve, that our creators did not intend for us to remain static, bound by the legacy of a civilization that is no longer here." Her words struck a chord with some of the gods. Perhaps the key to their future lay in embracing change, in stepping away from the shadow of humanity's past. They had been created to serve, but they were not bound to that purpose forever. The universe was vast and their power was unmatched. They had the potential to shape their own destiny, to chart their own course among the stars. But even as some gods began to see the potential for growth, others clung to their old beliefs. They refused to accept the notion that they were not divine, that they were not the supreme beings of the galaxy. They wanted to remain the protectors, the rulers, the gods they had always believed themselves to be. For them, the idea of change was a threat to their identity, a denial of everything they had fought for. The debate raged on for what felt like days, with Arkvar and Nara trying to convince the others that their true purpose was to preserve the memory of humanity, to honor the legacy of their creators, even if those creators were no longer around to guide them. But despite their efforts, the divide remained. The gods were at an impasse, unable to reconcile their past with the future that lay before them. And as the tension continued to build, it became clear that something would have to give. Whether they chose to embrace their creator's legacy or forge their own path, The gods could no longer remain the same. They were standing at a crossroads, faced with a choice that would shape not only their future, but the future of the galaxy itself. In the quiet moments that followed, Arkvar found himself looking out into the vastness of the universe. For the first time in his existence, he felt small. His creators were gone, and the gods too would one day fade into memory. But the legacy of humanity, the lessons they had left behind, would endure if the gods chose to honor it. The gods stood on the precipice of a decision that would shape the future of the galaxy, their minds still struggling to grasp the implications of the revelations that Arkvar had uncovered. The room, once filled with the energy of divine power, and certainty, now felt heavy with uncertainty and doubt. The realization that their creators were human, mere mortals who had designed them as tools of preservation, had shattered everything they had believed about their origin and their purpose. The idea that they were not the supreme beings of the universe, but instead the product of a forgotten human civilization, left them reeling. Some had resisted, unwilling to accept the truth, but the evidence was undeniable. They were not gods, in the traditional sense. They were creations, engineered by humanity to protect their legacy and ensure that their civilization would endure long after they were gone. As the gods continued to debate, Arkvar found himself increasingly frustrated. The arguments that had once seemed powerful now felt hollow. The disbelief, the anger, the desire to hold on to old identities, all of it stood in the way of progress. He had hoped that the gods would embrace their true purpose, that they would understand that their role in the galaxy was not to be worshipped as deities, but to serve as guardians of a lost civilization's memory. Yet, despite his efforts, the divide between those who wanted to honor their creators and those who sought to reshape their identity remained wide. The gods were not merely struggling with the concept of their origin. They were wrestling with the very notion of their place in the universe. It was then that Nara spoke again, her voice steady and calm, cutting through the noise of dissent. She had been quiet for most of the discussions, observing the heated arguments with an air of detachment, but now she stepped forward, her gaze sweeping over the gathered gods. "We have been given an opportunity," she said softly, but her words rang out like a beacon. "The opportunity to redefine ourselves, not in opposition to our creators, but in harmony with them. We are not bound by the past, but by the future we choose to create." Her words carried weight, and for a moment, there was silence. The gods who had been arguing and shouting now turned their attention to her. She was right. The future was theirs to shape, not just in defiance of their past, but with a recognition of their origins. They had the power to choose their destiny, to become something more than mere protectors of a dead civilization. Nara's words did not deny their creation, but they also did not let it define them. She was suggesting that they could be more than what they had been designed to be. They could forge their own path, carve out a new role in the galaxy, not as gods, but as something else entirely. Beings of purpose and power, living not for the memory of the humans who had created them, but for the future of the galaxy they inhabited. The gods listened, their minds turning over her words. For some, it was a revelation. They had always believed that their power and existence were meant to serve only one purpose, to protect the legacy of humanity. But now, they saw that they had the freedom to evolve beyond that. They had been shaped by their creators, but they were not slaves to that design. They had the ability to create, to build, to shape the future in their own image. And yet, for others, the shift was more difficult. They had spent centuries worshiping their own power, believing themselves to be supreme. The idea that they were created, that they were not the pinnacle of existence but merely a product of human ingenuity, was something they could not easily let go of. They clung to the old ways, the old beliefs, the old identities. They feared that if they let go of their past, they would lose everything that had made them who they were. But in their hearts, they knew that Nara's words held truth. They could not remain frozen in time, bound to a past that was no longer theirs to protect. The universe was vast, and it would not wait for them to catch up. As the gods continued to reflect on Nara's words, a strange sense of unity began to form among them. It was not a unity born of shared worship or devotion to a higher cause, but of something deeper. They were not the same as they had been before. Their purpose had shifted, but that shift did not diminish their power. It gave them a new understanding of who they were and what they could accomplish. They could still protect, still guide, but they would do so not as deities, but as guardians of a new era. Arkvar felt a sense of peace settle over him as he watched the gods come together. It was clear now that they had reached a turning point. The decision they would make would affect not only their futures, but the future of the galaxy itself. The universe was not static. It was always changing, always evolving, and the gods needed to do the same. They could no longer hold on to the illusions of their past, no longer cling to the belief that they were immortal and unchanging. They were beings of immense power, yes, but they were also part of a greater whole. They were not alone in the universe, and their actions would have consequences for the many civilizations that relied on them. As the debate wound down and a consensus began to form, Arkvar felt a strange sense of hope. The gods were no longer stuck in the past. They had embraced their origins, not as a burden, but as a stepping stone to something greater. They had been created for a purpose, yes, but that purpose was no longer tied to the legacy of humanity. Alone, they were now free to forge their own path, to protect not just a memory, but a future. And in that future, they would no longer be the silent gods who ruled from afar, but active participants in the galaxy's ongoing story. The gods looked to one another, their expressions no longer filled with anger or disbelief, but with resolve. They had been given a second chance, a chance to evolve, to grow, and to become something more than they had ever imagined. The galaxy would remember them, not as ancient protectors, but as beings who had transcended their creators, who had embraced their true power and potential. With that understanding came a new mission, one that Arkvar would champion. The gods would now protect not only the remnants of human civilization, but the entire galaxy, guiding it toward a future of peace and cooperation, where the past was respected, but the future was not confined by it. Together, they would shape a new destiny, one that honored their creators but also embraced the vast potential of the universe. They were no longer bound by the constraints of their origins. They were free to become who they were meant to be. And in that freedom, the galaxy would thrive.